gotta do what I gotta do.
Hello and welcome to episode 9 of the MMA Rundown podcast. My name is Ben Gordon. I'll be your host once again. This week we're going to be going over the event in Nashville, UFC Nashville on FS1. I'll be going in depth on the final 4 fights in the main card, and then also recapping the rest of the card, and then as far as like the rest of the main card and the other fights on there. Also be talking about Frank Mir and his steroid suspension, and a couple other big stories that are going on in MMA now. Unfortunately, the UFC is not going to have another event for a few weeks. That'll be UFC 211, so not a whole lot to preview, but a good amount of stuff to recap this week. And to start off, we'll be looking at Cub Swanson against Artem Lobov. Now, this was a fight where when I was going through my preview last week, I was saying Artem really doesn't deserve to be in this fight. He talked his way into it, and good on Artem for doing that. He got himself good exposure in the main event, and even in this loss, you'd probably say it's a good loss for him. He performed pretty well. He won the first round on a couple of the judges' scorecards. I gave him the first round as well. So not the worst fight for Artem. And the thing that I was saying is, if Cub's going to win this fight, he could use his grappling and have a huge advantage, or he could keep this fight standing where he's still the better fighter and give Artem a better chance, because Artem's mostly a stand-up fighter. He's okay grappling. He's a decent defensive grappler, not a great offensive grappler. And this fight really showed that. When they were on the feet in the first round, Artem came out really strong, was able to get the better of him, although it wasn't like overwhelming. But Cub made some adjustments, got better later on, but was also able to take Artem down multiple times, do some damage on the ground, but not really get to the point where he was really like passing him out and getting to a point where he's about to finish. But either way, if we're going to look at where these two fighters go from here, for Artem, you figure his next fight is going to be a good exposure fight too. If he's on a pay-per-view, it's probably going to be on a main card. If he's on FS1 or Fox, he could still potentially find himself, probably not in a main event again, but you'd be looking at a co-main event or a featured bout. So good for him in his career. As far as who he would get put up against, he's going to probably call out another guy who's hanging around the top 15 and get himself a big name fight. If you're the UFC, I don't really know that Artem's at a point where you feel like he's the kind of guy where you give him time and he's going to be able to build into a star. I think as far as his fighting goes, he'll get better, obviously, as he continues to train, but it's not like he's ever going to grow into a fighter where his skill set is a top 15 skill set, or that he's ever really going to make a run at the title. So he's the kind of guy you want to use for future bouts, and kind of use his name and his connection to Conor McGregor to help sell some lower level fights. So as far as names go for that, I don't know that I have anyone in particular. I mean, it seems like Artem's the kind of guy where he'll find someone to pick on and they'll get pissed off and say yes. So really for him, just keep finding feature bouts. Hopefully he'll keep finding bouts against guys who want to stand with him, because that's really where he's going to have the most exciting fights, and that's where he's going to have the best chance of pulling an upset too. For Cub, he's kind of in a weird spot where beating Artem really doesn't move him up any further than he already was. He was already number 4 in the division. Most of the guys who are ahead of him already hold victories over him. He had that 8-second knockout to Jose Aldo. Now, granted, that's been so long ago where if Cub actually did make a good run, you could say, okay, fine, that was so long ago and it was a bit of a fluke. Let's have a rematch. But that's not a fight that makes sense right now. Aldo has Holloway up next, and you'd have to wonder beyond that who'd be next for him. But again, that's further down the line. Max Holloway has a win over Cub Swanson, so again, the same type of thing there. That's a tough fight to sell again. Frankie Edgar was very dominant over Cub Swanson. I think Chad Mendes would be the one guy who Cub hasn't fought that's towards the top right now, but Chad Mendes is on a steroid suspension, so it doesn't seem like we'll be seeing him back anytime soon. So for Cub Swanson, it seems like he's going to kind of get stuck in a similar position where he's going to be fighting a guy who's ranked below him, in a position where when he wins, he's not really going to advance a whole lot, but if he loses, he could really fall back pretty far. And that's pretty unfortunate for him, but that's kind of the state of the division. So for him, I'd be looking at other guys who are in the top 10. As far as whether you want to get a guy who's up and coming and poses a great risk to you, or a guy who's kind of more established and have a bit of a slugfest, I don't know. You could look at a guy like Jeremy Stephens, for example, where Stephens, granted he's coming off of a loss, but he was ranked number 5 at the time. Good name there. That's a fight where you can definitely sell that as an exciting matchup. Again, Cubs, sometimes you'd like to see him use his jiu-jitsu a little bit more, use his grappling a little bit more, but you could see him going into a fight with Stephens and being willing to throw down, and that could be a really fun fight to watch. So for him, that's probably what I would imagine comes next, is a guy like a Jeremy Stephens, someone else who's in the top 10, where if he gets a win, you can still kind of say, hey, look, I'm beating the top guys, and maybe everything else sorts itself out. The loser of the Holloway and Aldo fight, maybe they kind of get brushed away, and it gives a couple a little bit of space where if he can get a couple big wins, he might find himself in the title picture. Again, there's the Yair versus Frankie fight too, depending on how Yair does. Now, granted, Yair's worked with Greg Jackson's, so I'm not entirely sure if Cub and Yair would ever end up fighting because of that, or what the status is with that. Obviously, BJ Penn was supposedly working with Jackson's too, and Yair and BJ fought. So that could be a little bit odd, but that'd be an exciting fight as well. But only time will tell on this one. Hopefully Lobov gets another guy who's got a decent name for him, and he can kind of work his way a little higher up on the card than he probably deserves skill-wise. And for Cub, a fight like Jeremy Stevens or against another top-ranked featherweight is probably going to be what's best for him at this point. In the co-main event of the evening, Al Iaquinta came back from a 2-year layoff and fought against Diego Sanchez. He was able to win this fight by first-round knockout. And when I was talking about this fight last week, I didn't really exactly see this happening as far as how this fight was going to go. I actually also put money down on Diego Sanchez, and my reasoning was fairly simple in that when you have a long layoff or when you're making your debut in the UFC, a lot of times you kind of have like your jitters, you kind of have like your adrenaline dump. Now, obviously, this isn't Al Iaquinta's debut, but it was his first fight in a long time, and it sounded as though after he had stopped fighting, he really wasn't training a whole lot. He was doing a lot of work with Realty, and it seemed like he was kind of content on being done with MMA, but he made his comeback. So to me, this seemed like a fight where Al was going to come out a little bit slow. And when you're having your first fight back, the worst kind of opponent for you to face is a guy like Diego Sanchez, who's going to keep a really high pace, who's going to come after you, and who's not going to get tired. So I figured that would be an issue for Al coming into this fight. I thought he was probably the better striker, but given his inactivity and given Diego's style, that would be trouble for him. And obviously we saw this happening with Diego very recently with his fight against Marcin Held. Held, again, was a pretty heavy favorite in that fight as well. This was a little bit worse for Held because not only was it his first UFC fight, but he was also fighting at elevation in Mexico City, whereas this fight was in Nashville, so much closer to sea level. But even still, Diego, we saw him get knocked out against Joe Lozon. His chin isn't what it used to be in that you'd see in the past he'd get into these wars, take some seriously hard shots, and keep fighting. Whereas now, it's not that he has a bad chin now, but he's got like a more human chin, it kind of feels like, where if you hit him really hard, he'll go down and you'll be able to finish him, where in the past, the hard shots, they'd rock him, but he'd still keep fighting. So Al was able to hit him pretty early on in the fight and had Diego rocked, stayed pretty calm and stalking him down, got him again, finished the fight, and that was that. So at this point, there's a lot of people talking about whether or not Diego Sanchez should retire, and there are a couple angles to take on this. If you're looking at it from Diego's standpoint of if he ever wants to make another title run again, I think it's pretty clear at this point he's not going to make a title run. He's still a very skilled fighter. Pretty good striking, his grappling, he's been at a black belt level for a while, decent wrestling. Like, he definitely can fight at a UFC level, and even if he keeps fighting now, there are a lot of guys in the UFC where he can either be very competitive or get the win. So he's definitely capable of fighting, he's just not going to ever really get back into the title picture at this point, especially at lightweight, which is just a brutally competitive division for him to be in. So for Diego, you probably want to say, hey, look, you've been in a lot of wars. If you're not ready to retire, which he said he wasn't going to retire, but if you're not quite ready, look for a couple more fights, but now is about the time to start to have an exit strategy. You're not going to make it to the title. At this point, you might have a couple more exciting fights left in you, but you're not really going to go too far. For Al Iaquinta, this is an interesting one for him because, again, he has been in the past, he's kind of came out of the fight pretty angry. He didn't really seem all that optimistic about his future. He's a guy who's definitely a top 10 fighter. I think you'd have to say he was hovering around the top 10 when he left. A big win like this over Diego Sanchez shows he's still elite, still a very good striker, pretty solid all-around grappler as well. So I'd like to see him against a guy who is currently ranked in the top 10 and see where he goes from here, but it's unclear whether he wants to chase after it again or whether he's really pissed at the UFC again and now he's going to have another long layoff until something clears over with him. I'm not entirely sure where it goes, but if he continues fighting, hopefully the next thing for him is a top 10 opponent and we can see where he fits into the rankings and see how far he can go. I don't know that I see him as a title contender necessarily. I wouldn't see him beating Conor. I wouldn't see him beating Tony Ferguson. I wouldn't see him beating Khabib. Edson Barboza, that'd be a tough fight for him. Like there are a lot of guys that are at the top of that division where
it seems like his ceiling isn't quite at their level, but he's a very talented guy. He's got a very interesting personality. I know in ways you don't really want to constantly shit on your boss. It's never really a good thing in most avenues, but the way that he goes about it in a way, and this is something that Ariel brought up in their interview on the MMA Hour on Monday, in a way that could benefit him because having that tension with the boss is an exciting storyline in its own right. Whereas whether Al in his next fight, whether he's fighting some no-name guy from Europe that you've never heard of, or whether he's fighting against a big-name guy in the top 10, like another storyline that's going to come into that, and even if it's not one that the UFC really promotes, is going to be, if Al wins, does he take another shot at the UFC? Do you get to see Dana in the background, maybe see him get pissed off if Al wins? If Al loses, how does the UFC handle it? Like there's kind of like the Al versus UFC thing that's going to be a storyline no matter who he's fighting, and that's an interesting storyline as it goes. Then if he has an exciting matchup anyway, then that just kind of, you can kind of just add it on and make it an even more interesting fight to sell. So for him, hopefully he gets a top 10 opponent. Diego, definitely not a guy in the top 15. Hopefully he kind of starts to wind down his career and end on a couple wins, and hopefully he'll get in the Hall of Fame either next year or the year after. In the next featured fight on the card, Ovince St. Preux fought against Marcos Rogerio de Lima. This was the second fight in a row where de Lima missed weight at 205, or again, it would be the 206 limit for him since it's a non-title fight. It looks as though if he's going to stay in the UFC, which I think is a little questionable at this point based off of how this fight went, it'll be at heavyweight. But again, UFC is having trouble with their heavyweight division as far as depth goes, so perhaps he could be lucky in that if you're going to move into any division after a loss, heavyweight might be the one just because there's such a lack of talented guys up there. But he fought against Ovince St. Preux, who was coming off of a 3-fight losing streak on his own right. It was interesting to kind of see how this fight was going to go for OSP. You weren't sure if the loss to John Jones and maybe even the injuries that he suffered in there were going to just kind of derail him all the way down. It was good for him that he was able to get a win here. There were some good striking exchanges from him. But ultimately, when this fight got to the ground and it got to a finish, again, so here's what's interesting. In general, in MMA, especially at the highest levels, if you're getting caught in a Von Flue choke, it's really a bad sign on you, because to get caught in a Von Flue choke, in most cases, and in this case, for example, it's because you're going for a guillotine choke when you don't have it, and instead of making a proper adjustment, you keep holding it for who knows what reason. Now, with a lot of guys in the UFC, when you're at that level, a lot of these guys are really well conditioned, and when you're in the training room, sometimes you can hold guillotines from bad positions, and your squeeze is so tight that either the guy you're rolling with just kind of waits it out and really just kind of stalls it out and doesn't do anything, or maybe it's even effective against them. But when you're at the highest level in the UFC, it's not going to work like that. You can't just use what's essentially just a shitty headlock from when the guy's on the wrong side of you and expect to hold on to it and expect for that to actually lead anywhere positive for you. Especially when you're fighting a guy like OSP, where you've seen him hit the Von Flue choke a couple of times already. You have to know that you're going for the guillotine. The second he starts passing your guard to the opposite side, Von Flue choke's coming. You got to let go. And I mean, really, you should be letting go anyway and trying to adjust and get your guard back. If he's going to half guard, at least try to lock down the half guard. And at that point, your far side to the side, the arm, let's just say that he's passing to the right side, for example. So if OSP's head is on my left and his body is passing to my right, and I keep a hold of that choke, I'm going to be open to the Von Flue choke. But if I hold the choke anyway, and let's just say I even catch him in half guard and I'm still have my arm around his neck, that's really not ideal for me. In half guard, where I want to be is I want to have the far side underhook, which would be my left arm, or the choking arm in this case, and I want to be up on my side. And depending on how you're trying to finish your guillotine choke, and especially in a case like this where Ovince St. Preux is driving into him, you're definitely not getting the far side underhook because you're using it to hook the neck. And getting up on your side, I mean, maybe you're trying to cut an angle from there, but even then, that's probably even worse for you in order to finish the choke. So either way, your next step is to let go and try to work from there, work into some kind of half guard position. Maybe if he's already getting past, then get in a defensive position where you can kind of work your way out. But to just hang on to the choke, it's not a good move, especially when you know what your opponent can do. De Lima held onto it anyway. OSP was near the fence. I mean, OSP could finish you with a Von Flue choke even if he was in the middle of the mat, but when he's up against the fence and he has a chance to drive off of it, it's a bad position to be in. And De Lima got caught, he got finished. And for OSP, with this being a choke that he's hit so many times, part of it you kind of have to wonder if it's one of those things where sometimes maybe you do hold on to that choke a little bit longer than necessary, but usually guys aren't quick enough or aren't like sharp enough to be able to catch you with it. Where OSP, like your margin for error is smaller, but either way, good for OSP to get another win by Von Flue choke. You can definitely tell he's looking for it, and you can definitely tell it's a choke that he's really mastered well. And for De Lima, and I guess really for anyone who's going to fight OSP in the future, if you're going for a guillotine on him, you really want to make sure you secure the far side so he can't pass there anyway, but if he does pass, you better be ready to let go quick. The last fight from Nashville that I'll go in depth on is one where I had a lot of information coming into this fight. I didn't really want to get too specific about it in the preview show. And I guess now that it's over and now that I've kind of talked to some people who've been involved, I feel like I can say a little bit more than I had said before. So just to kind of clear this up, I train at New Breed Jiu-Jitsu Academy, which is also where Eddie Wineland trains and where he does his camp. So I kind of saw him training in preparation for this fight. I had a rough idea of what his game plan was. I wasn't like briefed on it or anything. Obviously, there's no need to tell anyone other than Eddie Wineland specifically what you're looking for, but you can kind of tell by what you see in sparring, what you're seeing in drilling, what the idea is. And what I noticed coming into this fight is that Eddie was really ready to take on a guy who was going to take some chances offensively, go for some crazy kicks, maybe some crazy punches, really being able to counter that and land his own hard shots. And headed into this fight, when the fight was first announced, I thought it was a really bad matchup for Eddie because of the speed difference. But the more I saw him spar and the more I saw him kind of adjust with that kind of a game plan, the more I felt like this was going to be a much closer fight than anyone really anticipated. And it seems like Dodson was aware of that too. I don't know whether his game plan changed, whether he got any kind of intel, or maybe it was just knowing you're fighting a guy like Eddie, you got to be careful. So when this fight, once it happened, it just kind of became a thing where Dodson wasn't really doing a whole lot of the aggressive stuff that you're used to seeing him do. He wasn't throwing a lot of crazy kicks. He wasn't trying to like leap across the cage and use his speed offensively as much. It was more just he was keeping his distance well. Anytime Eddie would try to punch, he'd get out of the way, get out really quick. There was some countering from him, but a lot of it was just he'd kind of land one shot here or there. It'd be like one shot, two shot. But there weren't like really any big combos landed from either guy. And just like by the end of the fight, it just felt like it was a 15-minute sparring match where Eddie never really got his offense off and Dodson never really took too many chances. So if we're going to look at it from Dodson's standpoint, for him, he's a guy who ranked at number 7, where I think he's ranked a little lower than he probably deserves to be. He had that loss to Lineker, but that was a fight where I still feel like he got robbed in that decision. I think Dodson did win that fight. And if Dodson beats Lineker, then all of a sudden it's going to be him who's fighting TJ Dillashaw for a shot at the title, not Lineker. I don't know that Dodson beats Dillashaw again. He's obviously beaten him before, so you can't really count him out. And really, in that specific matchup, if you've been knocked out by a guy once, it can kind of change how you fight him, whereas the fight with Lineker, Dillashaw didn't really have anything hanging over his head like that. So with this win, it seems like the top 3 guys are pretty tied up right now, where TJ's got a fight with Cody. You've got Dominic Cruz, who's just getting healthy right now, and it sounds like he would either be returning for a super fight with Demetrius by the time he's ready to come back, or he'd be fighting for the title. On top of that, I think a guy like Jimmy Rivera is... You got Jimmy Rivera, but you've also got Lineker. Lineker and Dodson just fought, so I don't know that that's a fight you're going to make again. But you can possibly give John Dodson Jimmy Rivera at this point. I think that'd be a very interesting fight. Or depending on how the fight with Garbrandt and Dillashaw goes, if Dillashaw loses, perhaps you can put Dillashaw and Dodson together. But again, that fight's kind of down the line as far as it being in July. Right now we're in April. Does Dodson want to wait 3 months to find out who his opponent might be? And then obviously if Dillashaw gets hurt in that fight, he's going to need a lot of time for the next fight. So that could be a really long layoff for Dodson. I don't know if he wants that. So it seems to me like his options are kind of limited. You'd like to see him against a guy who's hanging around the top 3, top 4, but it seems like Rivera might be the guy who he gets put up against, which isn't a bad fight, but it's not exactly one that's going to spring him right away into the title picture if he does win it. For Wineland, he was hanging outside of the top 15. He got his fight with Frankie Saenz, who was ranked in the top 15 at the time. Was able to get a knockout win there. He fought Takeya Mizugaki, got another knockout. And now with the loss against Dodson, it kind of pushes him back again. As far as the matchmaking goes, I don't know who the UFC or who Sean Shelby would be looking to put him up against at this point. You could look at another top 15 guy. You can look at a veteran, not necessarily Mizugaki because they just fought, but someone like that. It doesn't seem like at this point a title run is imminent for Eddie Wineland, so you probably want to give him another guy who's kind of on the outside of the top 15, whether you're going to test a prospect or give him a veteran. But either way, it was a tough matchup for Eddie. Eddie's got a style that is pretty particular. It's one of those styles where he's a very, very difficult boxer to deal with. He hits incredibly hard. He's got a very unique style to him. He's a tough guy to go after because he's really good at counterpunching you. If you back up too much, though, he can kind of corner you and crack you pretty hard too. If you're going to try to grapple him, he's a very good defensive wrestler. You get him down, he's very good at getting back to his feet. So if you're looking at a style that's going to give him problems, you're looking at a guy who's going to say, okay, fine, I'm going to strike with him and I'm going to hopefully not get caught by his power. We're looking for a guy who's going to say, I'm going to be able to grapple him and actually be able to control him. And really, there haven't been a whole lot of guys who have been terribly dominant on either end. You've had Johnny Eduardo, who's obviously a top Muay Thai guy out from Brazil. He was very successful standing up. And you had Brian Caraway, who was able to get the takedowns and be able to control once he got on the ground. But for the guys who haven't been able to dominate on one end or the other, Eddie's been a very difficult fight for them. And there are a lot of guys in the top 15 who I don't really see being able to dominate on one end or the other. So Eddie can still be in the top 15. He can still beat some very good guys, but I'm not sure who he's going to be matched up with next. So again, the first four fights on the card, or I guess the final four fights on the card, it was Cub Swanson defeating Artem Lobov in a 5-round decision. You had Ally Quinta knocking out Diego Sanchez in the first round. You had OSP with another one of his Von Flue chokes. We can call it a Von Flue choke, or a Von Prue choke. I guess whatever you want to call it now at this point. It's known as a Von Flue choke, though. And you also had Eddie Wineland being defeated by John Dodson via decision. The other fights on the card, you had Joe Lozon versus Stevie Ray. Lozon came out looking really strong in this fight. It seems like he blew his wad after the first round, though. He was able to get Stevie Ray down, controlled him from the ground. Ray was good enough to kind of defend himself from a lot of submissions. Did get his guard passed a few times, gave up some pretty bad positions, gave up some 4-point positions, which, again, if you don't compete in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a 4-point position would be mount or the back. But overall, by the end of that round, he looked pretty exhausted. You'd have to give that round to him 10-8. The next round, Ray was pretty dominant on the feet. Now, Lozon did get him down, but when he was on top, he was just kind of trying to hold him there and catch his breath. So that's a fair round to give 10-9 to Stevie Ray. So you're looking at the third round where if it's another 10-9, Ray probably this fight probably goes to a draw. And Ray was even more dominant with his boxing. He didn't throw any kicks to risk getting taken down. It was scored 10-8 on a couple of the judges' scorecards. I don't see a problem with that being a 10-8 round. So in the end, that's how the fight went. Stevie Ray got the decision despite losing the first round 10-8. And it's a big win for him. This is his first fight in America. I believe he's 5-1 in the UFC now. But Lozon's a big name for him to beat. Even though Lozon doesn't appear to be what he used to be, he's still a really talented fighter, still a very talented grappler. Even if Lozon's chin gets to the point where it's diminishing, his grappling is still improving. And to be able to, granted, he certainly didn't look great on the ground, but to be able to survive and keep your wits about you, keep your energy about you, and for you to be the one who's in the position where you're getting pounded on in the first round, and to have the guy who is on top to be the one who's exhausted and not you, that's a good sign for Stevie Ray. So hopefully he'll get another fight against a top guy. Hopefully this time it's a top 15 guy instead of a guy like Lozon where he's got a big name but not exactly a big ranking. And then for Lozon, he's obviously a very exciting fighter. He's obviously still capable of fighting. He's never really been a guy who's been that close to title contention outside of, I believe he was in contention after he had knocked out Melvin Gillard, but then lost to Anthony Pettis quickly after and never really got close to the title picture again. So he's right about where he's always been. I don't know at what point he feels he needs to stop fighting, whether it's once he gets really chinny or what it is, but for him, with his name, with his background, you can always put him in another fight against a guy, whether it's an up-and-comer or whether it's just a fight where you're looking to come up with an exciting matchup to put on a main card. Lozon will still be available for that. Next fight was Jake Ellenberger versus Mike Perry. Ellenberger actually looked really good in this fight. I would say he won the first round. Really good head movement, but man, between the fights he's had in the past and the fact that he's training with guys like King's MMA where they spar really hard, it seems like his chin has really taken some hits over the years, and it just felt like when this knockout happened, the punch that dropped him, the left hook, again, Mike Perry hits very hard, so it's hard to say that it wasn't a terribly hard shot, but it didn't look like the type of shot that normally puts someone on the ground and it put him down. But then once they were clinched up, once they were getting that break, it felt like it took 5 seconds. It was probably just like 1 second, if not less. But like on that break, we were just waiting for Perry to throw a right, and I guess for whatever reason, whether Ellenberger's hand wasn't able to get in the way or what happened, wasn't prepared for it. Perry decided to throw an elbow there and put him out viciously. Ellenberger was not moving for a long time, and it's kind of frustrating as a fan to watch it on TV and just be like, hey, can you at least like get the camera over to Ellenberger? I want to know that he's okay. And they never showed him again, but it's not, obviously he's still alive. He went to the hospital, got discharged, and has a 60-day suspension, which is fairly standard for a knockout. But at this point for Ellenberger, I don't know what you really want to do with him. It doesn't seem like a title run's going to be in his future, and the path to get there is going to be through some heavy hitters, and you don't want to see something like this happen again. So hopefully he's in a place financially where he can maybe take 1 or 2 more fights if he even needs to at this point, and be ready to move on with his life. And for Mike Perry, it's a big win for him. It's a win over a ranked fighter. I think from a technical standpoint, I don't know that I would say that Mike Perry is a better fighter, but at this point his chin's better, his punching power is better, and that's what got him the win there. With the fight with Alan Jouban, he fought another guy who was more skilled than him. Jouban didn't go down quite as easily, obviously, and Jouban got the win. I don't know that I see Mike Perry as a guy who's going to be a title contender necessarily, but he's going to give some of the guys who are kind of floating around in the middle some trouble. So at this point, you probably want to start looking around like the back half of the top 10, but I don't know that I see him as a really dangerous threat to the best guys and the more technical guys. Looking at some of the other fights on the FS2 prelims, Talish Leites beat Sam Alvey. Leites hadn't had a win for quite a while. He was actually looking really good, almost got himself into title contention. He had a fight with Michael Bisping, where I believe he lost that one 3 rounds to 2. It was a really close fight. But ever since then, he's just been on a slide. Sam Alvey, I mean, he just kind of is what he is. You had Brandon Moreno versus Dustin Ortiz. Moreno's really impressed me a lot. Now, granted, his one fight in the house in the Ultimate Fighter was against Pantoja, who was the number 1 seed, and it was a close fight. But for him to do as well as he has ever since joining the UFC, and for him to be a top 10 fighter heading into this fight, and to beat a guy who's also a top 10 fighter, that's a really big sign for him. I don't think he's ready for a guy like Mighty Mouse yet, but he's showing improvements. He's getting better every fight. He's training with a good group of guys. He's training with Cejudo. And I think he's a guy who you're going to have to watch out for in a division that's really been lacking contenders for a while. He's going to be a guy who could potentially find his way in there in a year or so. Scott Holtzman defeated Michael McBride. Jessica Penne lost a decision to Danielle Taylor. Alexis Davis won a decision against Cindy Dandois. You had Brian Barberena getting another win against Joe Proctor. And on the first fight of the card, Hector Sandoval knocked out Matt Schnell. For a card that really lacked any fight that really drew a whole lot of interest heading into the card, definitely afterwards, some of the comments that were made by Ali Akinta drew a lot of interest afterwards. One of the big ones that he had was on Monday's edition of the MMA Hour. He was talking about how he felt like the UFC uses bonuses as a way to keep everybody in line, and he kind of said it was like a sort of a way to enslave them and make it where like you dangle out this $50,000 carrot and people are going to be nice. They're not going to speak out against you when you're doing the wrong thing, and hopefully if they do all the good stuff, then once they have a good performance, then they'll get their little bonus and they'll be happy. He talked about a lot of the wins that he's had, a lot of wins he's had by knockout where he doesn't get the knockout of the night bonus. If we're looking specifically at this event, whether or not it was fair that he didn't get the knockout of the night bonus, he had a great knockout, but you're not going to, if you're looking at fight of the night, his fight with Diego was not fight of the night, so you're already cutting him out of half of them. The way that Perry put out Ellenberger, that's a knockout of the year candidate, so you're not going to put him over that. And really, there were some other good finishes on the card. For him not to get it, I don't know whether they had decided, hey, Ali Akinta deserved a bonus here, but you know what, fuck him, we're not going to give it to him, or whether they just felt that the other options were better and that's what they chose. So in this particular case, it's kind of hard to say whether he got screwed or not. You'd still like to think that he can get a discretionary bonus, but I'm not exactly sure what WME has been doing on that end ever since they took over. It doesn't sound like they've been giving out discretionary bonuses as much, so for him not to get one isn't really all that surprising. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's in the doghouse, so that you'd have to imagine with the way he talks, he probably is in the doghouse anyway. But this idea that the UFC uses these bonuses to keep people in line, I don't know that I buy it. I think anytime you have an employer, whether there's a bonus structure or not, like it's always going to be easier if you stay in line and kind of work with what they want than it is if you're going to just kind of trash them to the media, trash them to the fans, and try to show them up on their own event. Like, you were at a UFC event. UFC got all these people to buy tickets to the event. They're paying you $26 and $26, so over $50,000 for your fight. And you go out on the mic and you're trashing them and saying that you don't like how they run their business. I mean, you can see why something like that would frustrate them, whether they're going to withhold a bonus from you or whether they're going to just be less eager to put you in a position where it's going to be easier for you to work your way to the title or work your way into a bigger spot. I mean, that's completely understandable, and I don't know that the implication that these bonuses are a negative thing is exactly a bad thing. I think it's hard to say that fighters would be any less willing to go for it if there wasn't the bonus than if there was. I think a guy like Mike Perry, whether a knockout of the night, the potential of a knockout of the night bonus is there for 50 G's or whether there's no bonus at all, like, he catches Jake Ellenberg with the hook and he gets into that little exchange where he's off of a clinch break. He's still going to throw that right elbow right as hard as he did, and he's still going to knock him out and keep him on the mat for a few minutes. So there's a different argument to be had as far as whether the bonuses have an extra value. It seems like they probably do, but either way, the thought that it's used as a control mechanism and the thought that it's just the UFC finding a way to keep everyone in line, I don't buy that. You're always going to have people at any company where they're kind of keeping their thoughts and they're keeping their actions in line with what the brass likes, and there's always going to be people who don't really agree with it and who are going to fight against it. So, what can you really do? And what's a bit of an older story that's kind of coming back around this week and sort of come full circle? Frank Mir was officially suspended for 2 years by USADA for failing a drug test. He had made a claim that it was from tainted kangaroo meat, and he, even with this suspension being levied down, he still feels like he was wronged here. He did bring up a few good points as far as what options a fighter has to fight against a positive drug test if they get popped for one, where he's talking about the costs that are involved. And to be fair, this is kind of like a tough one to deal with, because again, when you're dealing with these drug tests, it's not like it's a cheap thing for the companies to do. It's not a cheap thing to buy. So if you were to expect the UFC to have to pay for every appeal, especially when you have fighters who would probably be taking advantage of it, that probably wouldn't be the best situation. Then every time somebody pops for a drug, obviously you're going to play it off like, oh, me? No way. Couldn't happen. Let me appeal it. And it's just going to cost the UFC a bunch of money that they really shouldn't have to pay. As far as the companies themselves, whether they should have to cover it, I don't know how you could do that either. You can't really just get a bunch of free drug tests to double check and do all that. So for Frank Mir, this takes him out for 2 years. He was in a position leading into the suspension where I think a lot of fans, myself included, felt like it was probably about time for him to retire anyway. His chin obviously isn't holding up very well now at heavyweight. It's tough to have a good chin for a while with all the shots that you're taking, all the hard shots you're taking, but the way he was going down seemed a little bit easier than most heavyweights. So at this point, if he is going to continue, this could possibly be a good thing, and that it gives him some time where as long as he's not sparring too hard in the meantime, he can kind of recover a bit. But even still, he's not really going to ever make a run for the heavyweight title again, even with the heavyweight division being as bad as it is. He's already been a UFC champion. It's not like he feels the need to like cross it off his resume or cross that off of his bucket list before he leaves the sport. So if you're Frank Mir, you can keep doing podcasting. I don't know what kind of money he's able to make out of that. He can definitely do a lot of seminars. He's a guy who has a big enough name where if he wants to just kind of live humbly, he can open up his own gym. He can teach seminars. He can make a very strong living, make six figures, and be happy. But if he still wants to kind of live the life as a fighter, this is going to make it really tough for him. And I hope he doesn't. I know he wants to keep fighting. I know that ending your career that way isn't the best, but if you're Frank Mir, if you really enjoy the martial arts, you're going to be training anyway. If he decides to take a retirement fight, kind of like a Brad Pickett type of fight, after the suspension is up and just let it go out, that's fine. I respect that if that's how you want to end your career. If you'd rather end it in the cage as opposed to in the doctor's office, I get that. That's perfectly fine. But for him, maybe he's right. Maybe he is getting screwed here. Maybe the fact that it's so expensive to appeal is a real problem. Maybe, I mean, obviously, if you're looking at USADA, a lot of these drug testing laboratories, a bit of a problem that they have to deal with that doesn't get talked about a lot is it's so important for them to be right that if they actually do get something wrong, it's almost in their best interest to kind of hide it or to kind of make it as difficult as possible for people to kind of realize it. Because if you start having cases where you starting to have false positives, well, then the next time a positive comes up, how can you be so sure that they got that one right too, or if that one's false? So it's a tough situation for a fighter if you get tested positive. In some cases, these guys, they're able to prove it's a tainted supplement. They get off a little bit shorter, but even still, they get a suspension for it. But for Frank Mir, at this point, there's not a whole lot more he can do. It doesn't seem like it would make sense for him to really try to do a whole lot more, and hopefully just kind of wind down, figure out what you want to do after fighting, get everything set up for that, and hopefully if he's going to fight one more time, just make sure you settle in, find a guy who, I mean, I'm trying to think if Brad Pickett was supposed to fight. He fought Chito Vera, but I believe it was a guy out of Alliance. I can't remember who it was that he was originally supposed to fight, but regardless, the idea stands that at heavyweight, you find a guy who's outside of the top 25 that you can end your career on. Let it be a competitive fight, and hopefully for Frank Mir, he gets a win. He ends his career in the octagon instead of in the doctor's office and moves on. And I mean, really, there's a lot for him to be proud of. Multiple-time UFC heavyweight champion, first guy to finish Nogueira, finished him twice, as a matter of fact. A lot of great things that he did in his time, and hopefully this kind of spurs the end of it before he really does a whole lot more damage to his health. Transitioning from former WEC commentator Frank Mir being at a point where he's likely to retire, we got news that arguably the best WEC fighter ever, Miguel Torres, has decided to retire. And at this point in his career, it makes a lot of sense. He'd been on a pretty big downslope after leaving the UFC. Towards the end of his run in the UFC, it was getting pretty rough for him too. At his peak, I believe he was 37-1 heading into the Brian Bowles fight, but just a ridiculous record. When he was at his prime, very aggressive, went after a lot of guys, was able to get a lot of finishes. Really good black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, pretty good striking. Unfortunately, when he lost the fight to Brian Bowles in the WEC, at that point he made a move to TriStar and kind of got a little more tactical about how he fought, like to kind of hide behind his jab, but he wasn't the same aggressive fighter, and he wasn't really as effective ever since making that switch. Now, obviously for him, with all the shots he had taken up to that point with your 38 fights or so, I'm sure he was feeling it a bit. Towards the end of his career, he was getting knocked around pretty bad too, so I don't blame the guy for trying to fight safer, but obviously that wasn't going to lead to the best outcomes for him that he was seeing earlier in the WEC days. Now, obviously, with the WEC, technically for the WEC champion, you weren't a UFC champion, but as fans, we all know if you're a WEC champion at 35 or 45, you're really the UFC champion. The UFC just didn't have the weight class, so had the UFC absorbed the weight classes much sooner, we could be talking about Miguel Torres like we talk about GSP, like we talk about Anderson Silva, like we talk about Demetrius Johnson for their long title reigns. Unfortunately for Torres, it was under the WEC banner, so he's not going to get that kind of attention. He's not going to be talked about in that way, and that's really a bummer because he was so great at his peak. But even after the loss to Brian Bowles, there were still a lot of good fights from him. He had a fight in the UFC after they were absorbed where he had won against Mighty Mouse Johnson. That was a fight where the decision ended up going in Johnson's favor, but it was one of those decisions where when you watch the fight, you're like, how the hell did Johnson get the win? When Johnson was able to get Torres down, Torres was really good at getting sweeps, throwing up submission attempts. I mean, it was one of those fights where you feel like if it was watched under modern eyes, Miguel Torres gets the win. But it was kind of back in the day where you'd have a wrestler get in, they'd take a guy down, they'd bury their head in the other guy's chest and throw arm punches while fighting off a bunch of submission attempts, and the judges would say, okay, well, the guy had top position, so clearly he's winning, when in reality, all the offense is coming from the bottom. So, unfortunately for him, he didn't get that win. It'd be nice at this point for him to be able to say he's got a win over a guy who's being called the greatest of all time, but either way, great career for Miguel Torres. It's unfortunate that after he left the UFC, I believe it was a kickboxing fight where his knee just got blown out. But either way, he's got his academy out in Indiana. He'll be set. He can definitely make a good amount of money doing that. He'll be comfortable. Granted, you wish you could say he was a UFC champion, kind of use that to promote his seminars and promote his gym. But either way, I'm sure he'll be fine heading towards the next phase of life. And as a fan, I really, really appreciate what he did during his time in the WEC. Wish him the best. Over the last week and even in the weekend, I've been pretty busy, so that's why this episode ended up coming out late. And the plan going in was that I was going to give the promo of the week this week to Al Iaquinta. It was one of those ones where, on one hand, it's kind of tough that he's going after the UFC. That's not always the best move, but it also creates a little bit of heat, a little bit of fan interest, where a guy who's just top 10, who's sneaking into the top 10 of a really crowded division, might not get all this attention that he's getting right now. If you look at the interactions that he's getting on social media, even on sites like MMA Fighting when they run articles about Al Iaquinta, obviously what he's done has been positive for him on that end as far as drawing eyes to him. But in the meantime, TJ Dillashaw and Cody Garbrandt were just going at it again. Obviously, what had happened in the episode of The Ultimate Fighter, that was filmed a little while back, but obviously now it's coming to light and they're giving interviews and talking about it. And my biggest issue with Dillashaw for the longest time is that he's been a guy who in his interviews will go out and say, I don't care about promoting the fight, I'm just here to fight. And it's pissed me off so much to hear that from a guy who's so talented and a guy who's actually really exciting to watch. And the reason why is because as a fighter, you're not just an athlete, you're an entertainer. Sports, as I've mentioned before, and I'll have to keep mentioning it again, the sports industry is not an industry. Sports is just a subset of the entertainment industry. And especially in an individual sport like this, where it's based promotion by promotion, fight by fight, to just say, I'm not going to sell a fight, or I'm not going to go out of my way to be interesting, to make a good storyline, it'd be like if I was in marketing and I said, I'm just going to do whatever you ask me to do, but I'm not going to try to do anything extra. How long is my career going to last? It's not going to last long. And really for Dillashaw, his fighting skill is so high that it's still getting him paid decently, but he could be so much bigger. And finally, this matchup with Cody Garbrandt could be what he needs. Obviously, with a lot of guys, having the one rival can really be the thing that pushes them forward and gets people interested in seeing them fight. Cody seems to be the guy for him. Cody seems to be the guy who's pushing his buttons. And in an interview on UFC Unfiltered, TJ Dillashaw showed that he's got a little bit of wit and a little bit of an edge to him, and it's nice to actually see that, because when you hear about his gym stories, he's a guy who kind of goes a little bit too hard. He's really aggressive, but when he talks in front of the mic, he just tries to be really calm and, oh, I'm so humble, I don't really want to say too much. So to kind of get what's more of like the real TJ Dillashaw, to have the comment he made about Cody Garbrandt, if he's going to have a tape release for charity, that he can release it to a charity for fatherless kids so that their kids don't end up like Cody. Great line. So here's the clip.
Nah, man, no, it's just always noisy. I got a lift on my truck, and my tires need to be changed out.
Now, are you? Do you like Denver? I mean, you left from California to go to Denver. How do you like living there?
I love it out here, man. I'm building a house. I'm building my dream home right now on a lake. Walking out my backyard and jump in the boat. I'm pumped, man.
So you kind of like it. You know, so when you left Alpha Male, was the location you were going to just to train with who you're training with, or did you also love the idea of going to Denver itself?
No, it was just for training. I'm born and raised in California. I was in California. Came out here to Denver I was doing my camps out here with Dwayne Ludwig. You know, I didn't even plan on moving out here. I was just planning on doing my camps out here. You know, I was planning on doing camp for my fights, 8 weeks, 10 weeks or something like that with Dwayne. And then I still had my house in Sacramento. I'd be living in California. But, unfortunately that situation didn't really work out with Uriah and Team Alpha Male. They didn't want me jumping back and forth. So they kind of gave me an ultimatum. I got to choose one. So that's when I decided to sell my house and move out here.
And TJ, you said an ultimatum. Now of course we have to ask you. Uriah put out a Instagram video, which you may or may not have seen. He said, "Sad to see my former friend TJ Dillashaw lie about me on national television to save his reputation. He knows there was no ultimatum. He got lured by money." Why would Uriah come out and say that? Like, how
I thought it was funny. He showed that video, but never once did it say that I chose to be there, rather than what I was talking about was to sit. So I had already been gone. I came back to Sacramento to finish selling my house. I had already rented a place out in Denver. I was already in the middle of camp. I came back to finish selling my house in Sacramento, and one of my friends at the time, Joseph Buckles, I knew I was in town, asked me to come on the podcast and talk about life and what's going on with me and me being in Denver. And that was just me talking about the situation. Just because I was getting sponsored by Muscle Farm didn't mean that I was going to move my entire life to Denver. So that's a bold-faced lie, and he knows it, because I took him to lunch the day I decided to tell him, because I was going back and forth to my fight camps. I was doing 4 weeks in Denver, 4 weeks in Sacramento, going back and forth. And it was every time I came back from Denver, I realized that my training was better in Denver than it was in Sacramento at the time. So I told him, I was like, look, man, my next camp, I'm going to do my full camp out in Denver. And that's when he kind of flipped the lid. He just knew that. I think it was a way of him creating drama to try to get a title fight. I had the belt at the time. So really he's just being a bold-faced liar, because I took him to lunch and told him about it. He's the one that gave me the ultimatum. I mean, I left the gym in tears, man. like even when he gave me the ultimatum, I was coming in to like watch practices because I wasn't allowed to practice, and he said I couldn't do that anymore either. So he full on just kicked me out of the gym, and he can say whatever he wants, man. He knows what the truth is. I know what the truth is. All the guys there saw me leaving. Like, it wasn't like something that I wanted. You know, I didn't choose this.
Is there any kind, when you look back on the situation, I mean, we all go through these things in life. Does it make you angry or does it make you sad? Is there a possibility of a reconciliation someday? I mean, obviously not at this point, but how do you feel about that, or has the ship sailed on that?
Oh, it makes me sad, man. I mean, I had friends that I thought I was going to have for life, you know? I mean, for like best friends that I made for 6 years being there, some guys that I put some hard work in with, and, you know, guys like Justin Buckles, who I was in every one of his corners for his fight. He was in mine, and, you know, Danny Castillo, and then all of a sudden he gets cut from the UFC, and he flips the script, and now he's on the other side and doesn't stick up for me. So I feel like it's more sad than angry, you know, just because I am going to lose some guys that I cared about, you know.
How do you feel about Uriah going into the Hall of Fame, even though there's some bad blood between you guys?
When I was in wrestling in college, I had this guy I looked up to when he was fighting, you know, someone that made it from the wrestling background, you know, wrestled at UC Davis, and he paved the way for us, man. He was a very popular small guy, the first one, and been around for a long time. So, yeah, he definitely deserves it.
I was going to bring up, TJ, there's a lot of talk of you guys sparring in the video of Cody catching you. Now, I don't want to talk about if it happened, if it didn't happen, because personally, I feel like what should happen in the training room should pretty much stay there. I mean, at the time when you guys were sparring, you guys were teammates. So it's almost like in jiu-jitsu, you don't want to like tap and tell. It's kind of like bad etiquette. What do you feel about them bringing up, you know, the fact of them having a tape of a sparring session? Because not for nothing, there could be other sparring sessions where you had the better of them and stuff.
Well, TJ, before you answer, can I just say to the people who are listening who might not be aware that Cody put a video on Instagram saying, hey, TJ, let's put an end to this. I'm going to go out and get as much money from the video of me knocking you out. How about you pick a charity and I'll donate the money to it? He's claiming he knocked you out in a video of spar just to catch people up.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I should have set that up.
Yeah, and I'm telling him to go for it, release it, because I, for one, don't believe it. You know, even if he did, I agree with Matt. I think it's petty. I think they're reaching. You know, it's something like we put this time and sweat and tears into the gym, and he's got this one clip of him doing good. And what about the 70% of the time of when I was doing awesome? You know, that Buckles has footage of. You know, but you know what? Like, to bring up the whole point of what Matt's saying too is that I could care less what happened then. You know, because I get to make on pay-per-view some film of me beating Cody's ass that the world's going to see, and I'm going to make a lot more than selling it to TMZ. So they can do whatever they want with the practice room, because we all know how it went down. So I could care less. Release the footage. The charity should be something with kids without fathers, so they don't grow up to act like Cody.
Okay. So